Fahrenheit 451. So, Fahrenheit 451 is one of those books that sounds dramatic even before you open it, because everyone knows it's the book about burning books. But what's actually inside is a story about a guy named Guy Montag, who works as a fireman. Except in his world, firemen don't put fires out. They're sent to burn any books that still exist. The government in this future society has basically decided that books cause too much trouble. Too many ideas, too many opinions, too much thinking. So the safest thing, according to them, is to get rid of all of them. At the start, Montag doesn't really question any of this. He just does his job like everyone else around him. But then he meets a young girl named Clarice. She's a little unusual compared to the rest of society. She actually asks questions and pays attention to things. And those simple conversations start making Montag realize how disconnected everyone around him really is. People barely talk to each other, everyone's glued to huge television screens. Everything feels rushed and empty. As Montag becomes more curious, he secretly starts reading the books he's supposed to destroy. And that's when everything slowly unravels. His job, his relationships, and basically his understanding of the world. The more he reads, the more he realizes how much is being hidden from people, and how much the society has sacrificed just to avoid conflict or difficult conversations. Eventually, he has to make a choice between following orders or protecting this knowledge that's being quietly erased. Now, in real life, Fahrenheit 451 itself has had a strange history of being challenged. Over the years, different schools in the United States removed it or objected to sections because of things like harsh language, violence, and some dark themes involving suicide. And in a kind of ironic twist, a version of the book was once released with certain words removed, which Ray Bradbury later objected to, because censoring a story about censorship sort of defeats the whole point. Even with all of that, the book is still taught everywhere today, mostly because the message is actually pretty simple. When a society starts treating knowledge like a threat, and when people get uncomfortable with ideas that challenge them, you don't just lose books, you lose the ability to think for yourself. The Anarchist Cookbook. When you first hear the title, The Anarchist Cookbook, it sounds like a novel or some dark mystery story, but it's not really a story at all. It's a controversial manual written back in the early 1970s by William Powell, who at that time was basically an angry teenager frustrated with the Vietnam War and political tension happening around him. Instead of writing fiction, he collected information from public libraries and old military publications, and put it all together into one book that he believed expressed his anti-war views. The problem is that the content was focused on extremely dangerous things, so it immediately became one of the most controversial books ever printed. And in several countries, the book was restricted or banned entirely because of concerns that people could misuse the information. Even today, many places continue to treat the book as either illegal to sell or illegal to own. The book's name sometimes showed up in news reports, and that only increased the public concern around it. Even security officials in different countries reviewed it and considered parts of it dangerous. So in terms of banned books, this one is definitely not simply a novel that offended someone. It's considered highly problematic because of the kind of content it included. In his adult life, William Powell distanced himself from the book completely. He said he deeply regretted writing it and believed that violence was not a solution to political problems. He even tried to stop it from being published anymore. But by that time, many reprints and digital copies already existed, and it was basically out of his control. From a historical perspective, the Anarchist Cookbook is kind of a snapshot of a particular moment in American history, when the Vietnam War, political protest, and youth rebellion were all boiling together. But today, most experts refer to the book as an example of how easily information can be misused, and how something written in frustration can have long-lasting consequences. The Grapes of Wrath. The Grapes of Wrath starts with Tom Joad, who has just been released from prison on parole, and heads back to his family's farm in Oklahoma. But when he gets there, the house is basically abandoned. The farmland has been repossessed by banks during the Dust Bowl, so the Joads had no choice but to leave. Tom eventually finds them staying at his uncle's place, and they tell him the new plan. Pack everything onto a beat-up truck and drive toward California, because rumors say there are plenty of jobs picking fruit out there. It's not guaranteed, but it's basically the only option left. So the whole family, Tom, his parents, his siblings, their grandparents, begin this long road trip west, and pretty early, reality starts hitting them. The grandparents don't survive the journey, the truck breaks down multiple times, and slowly the family shrinks as people either die or get separated. When they finally reach California, it's absolutely not the promised land. Thousands of families just like them have also arrived looking for the same work, and big landowners take advantage of it. Tons of workers competing for too few jobs means extremely low wages and terrible living conditions. So, instead of rebuilding their lives, the Jodes end up moving from poor camp to poor camp. Tom sees children struggling to eat, people being hired for pennies, and police cracking down on anyone who tries to organize or protest. Eventually, things get more intense. A former preacher who travels with them tries speaking up for the workers and ends up being killed after a confrontation. Tom gets involved and ends up fighting back, which forces him to run again to avoid arrest and protect his family. By the end, the Jode family is almost split apart. The father is losing hope, the mother is trying to hold everyone together, and Tom has to secretly leave to stay out of trouble. When the book came out in 1939, a lot of landowners and business groups were furious at how they were portrayed, especially in California. There were claims that Steinbeck exaggerated the bad conditions of migrant workers, so certain counties refused to stock the book in libraries, and multiple school districts banned it for years. There were even public burnings in California by groups that believed the book made local farms look cruel. The Country Girls. So, if you've ever wondered what a banned book looks like when the dangerous content isn't violence or politics, but simply girls growing up, then Edna O'Brien's The Country Girls is a pretty shocking example. This book came out in 1960, and at first glance, it looks harmless. It follows two young Irish girls, Kate and Baba, who leave their small conservative town and move to Dublin chasing independence, adventure, and basically the opposite of everything their strict Catholic upbringing prepared them for. On the surface, it sounds almost wholesome, like a coming-of-age novel about friendship and first love, and it is that, but it's also much deeper. The novel starts with Kate, who grows up on a farm in rural Ireland. Her home life isn't very comforting, her father drinks heavily, her mother is stuck in a marriage that feels like a trap, and Kate watches all this with a quiet sadness. She's shy and observant, and tends to internalize a lot of what she feels. Baba, on the other hand, is basically the opposite. She's bold and rebellious and sometimes manipulative or genuinely protective, depending on the day. They go to a strict Catholic convent school where most of their education is basically teaching them how to behave and obey rules, and above all, how to not be curious about boys. Of course, nothing makes teenagers more curious about something than being told not to think about it. So naturally, both girls start dreaming of romance and freedom. Throughout the story, there's this feeling that Kate is searching for affection, while Baba is just impatient with the world and wants more excitement immediately. Their friendship is complicated, sometimes supportive, sometimes almost toxic. And O'Brien writes it honestly instead of romantically, which is part of what makes the book feel so modern even today. They start encountering actual relationships, real men, and complicated romantic situations that don't really follow the romantic ideals they grew up imagining. Kate becomes involved with an older married man, which is one of the reasons the book created controversy at the time. But the novel doesn't romanticize it. It's awkward and emotionally confusing, and often painful for Kate. It exposes how girls are socially encouraged to seek validation from older, more experienced men who promise emotional intimacy, but often give very little in return. This part of the book feels like watching someone step into adulthood before they're ready, because society didn't give her another blueprint. One thing that really stands out is how O'Brien writes girls' inner thoughts without sugarcoating them. Kate feels lonely and insecure and often unsure of herself, and the book takes her emotions seriously. You don't see a lot of novels from this era that treat young women's personal emotional lives as something worth writing about, and ironically, that honesty got the book labeled as immoral. Okay, here's the thing. The book wasn't banned because of anything extreme. It was banned in Ireland because it openly depicted female sexuality, desire, and emotional complexity. That might sound unbelievable today, but in 1960s Catholic Ireland, even acknowledging that young women had sexual feelings was considered socially dangerous. It was officially banned by the Irish Censorship Board. Clergy publicly criticized Edna O'Brien. Some local priests even burned copies. Her own family distanced themselves from the shame it supposedly brought. Edna O'Brien was actually born in the same kind of rural Catholic environment she writes about. People sometimes say banned books come from imagination, but in this case, she wrote her lived experience. O'Brien ended up leaving Ireland completely and built her literary career abroad. So the ban didn't just censor a book, it pushed out a writer whose voice could have been shaping the literary world of her own country from within. If someone only describes the book as coming of age, that's kind of missing the point. It's a story about constraints, the cultural constraint, religious constraint, and especially the emotional constraint placed on women. There's also a quiet critique of patriarchy, not with protests or slogans, but just by showing how female longing, curiosity, and identity get suppressed long before adulthood even begins. Dr. Zhivago. The novel follows Yuri Zhivago, a doctor and poet whose life gets swept along by war, revolution, and scandal. It's not simple, it's messy. Yuri is born just before Russia plunges into chaos. His childhood is marked by loss and displacement. As he grows, he trains to become a physician. He also writes poetry that are very reflective and sensitive, almost as if he lives in two parallel worlds, one of medicine and pragmatism, and another of art and emotion. Early in the story, Yuri becomes entangled reluctantly and painfully with Lara Antipova. Lara has her own tragic backstory, with uprooted childhood and social vulnerability, caught up in turbulent times. Their bond isn't a romantic fairy tale. It's a fragile, complicated refuge. They both carry scars, and their coming together becomes almost a defiance against the brutal reality unraveling around them. Because right outside their personal world, Russia is changing violently. The 1917 revolution and the ensuing civil war shake the country's foundations. The novel captures how ordinary people become unwitting actors in political drama. Survivors wander through snow, famine, and repression. Yuri, with Lara, or with his own family, keeps trying to hold on to humanity writing poetry, caring for loved ones, even as society seems bent on erasing individuality. The book doesn't pretend to resolve everything neatly. Its power lies in its realism in showing that in times of collapse, being human becomes a radical act. Now, from a storytelling point, that's one side. The other side is why the book became controversial and was banned where it mattered most, in the Soviet Union. Dr. Zhivago was completed in the mid-1950s and submitted for publication, but Soviet publishers rejected it. The official reason was that it didn't fit the required socialist realism. The book focused on individuals more than ideology. It painted revolution and civil war as violent rips in human lives. It showed that revolutions crush more souls than they save. That turned it from a novel into a threat in the eyes of those in power. Because of that ideological rejection, Dr. Zhivago couldn't be legally published in its native country. For decades, it existed only in the shadows, in hidden manuscripts. Then, in 1957, the novel was smuggled out of the Soviet Union. It was published in Italy almost immediately, and the impact was dramatic. It wasn't just literature returning to the world, it was like a voice of dissent. For the Soviet authorities, the international success of the book was an embarrassment. They condemned the author, stripped him of his membership in the Writers' Union, and pressured him to reject any honors. In 1958, when the world awarded Pasternak the Nobel Prize in Literature for his poetic and narrative achievements, the Soviet Union saw it as a political provocation, and Pasternak was forced to decline. The Color Purple. So The Color Purple might look like a quiet little Southern family story at first, but underneath, it's one of the most powerful journeys of survival and self-worth in modern American literature. The book follows a young African-American woman named Celie living in the rural American South during the early 1900s. Her life begins with trauma and silence and very little hope. She's basically taught from childhood that her voice doesn't matter and that she should stay small and invisible. But the story isn't just about the suffering, but also about what happens after. Celie is forced into a marriage with a man known only as Mr., who treats her like someone who's just supposed to cook, clean, and disappear. And honestly, Celie believes that's what life is. Just trying to survive without really living. She doesn't have many people to rely on, except her sister, Nettie, who's one of Celie's only sources of love and encouragement. The two of them write letters to each other. These letters basically become the whole structure of the book, and that's where Celie speaks honestly, something she's not allowed to do in real life. But eventually, Celie's world starts opening up. She meets people, especially women, who challenge everything she believes about herself. Women who are confident, outspoken, emotionally powerful, and completely opposite of what Celie was told a woman should be. And through those friendships, Celie slowly finds her voice, discovers her own worth, learns to stand up for herself, and begins rebuilding her life. What's really beautiful here is that Celie doesn't transform overnight. It's a very slow human process of growing into yourself. She learns how to love herself, how to forgive, and how to finally become the main character of her own life. Eventually, she builds a life full of creativity, independence, financial freedom, and genuine emotional connection, something she never believed she deserved in the beginning. Historically, The Color Purple has been challenged in schools and libraries in the United States because of sensitive depictions of racism, and its themes around identity and empowerment, and also discussions of topics that some groups felt were too mature for younger readers. Some school districts removed it, especially during the 1980s and 1990s, and even today it still appears occasionally on challenged books lists in certain places. Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman first published the book in 1855 when it was a slim volume of 12 poems, but in his lifetime he kept expanding it by adding and rewriting until what emerged was a massive collection of free verse poems that celebrated life, body, democracy, identity, nature, and the soul. Over time, the book grew. and by the final edition Whitman prepared, Leaves of Grass had become nearly 400 poems, which was a sweeping poetic tapestry of America, humanity, and everything in between. And what triggered outrage was how direct and alive and un-Victorian it felt. Whitman rejected all formal meter and rhyme, favoring a raw rhythmic free verse. His poems didn't speak of distant mythical lands or classical gods. Instead, they spoke of Americans, ordinary people, working with their hands, living in cities or on farms, loving, hoping. Poems like Song of Myself and I Sing the Body Electric celebrated flesh, blood, with all their imperfections and desires. The voice in these poems is boldly inclusive. The laborer and the immigrant, the soldier and the farmer, the sick and the healthy, people of every color and creed. Nature, cities, birth, death, everything becomes sacred. That radical equality and sensual humanness made the book a manifesto of sorts. The America of 1855 wasn't ready for a poet who spoke openly of bodies, of desire, of the human form, and yet claimed to love them without shame. The book's sensuality, its frank tone, alarmed people. Soon many libraries refused to stock it. Some bookstores turned it away. In one case, a man in a public office was fired simply because a copy sat on his desk. 19 minutes. So 19 minutes is one of those novels that makes you stop, think, and weirdly feel uncomfortable at how real everything sounds. The story takes place in a quiet town in New Hampshire, one of those small places where everybody kind of knows everybody, and nothing dramatic ever seems to happen, until everything changes in just 19 minutes. The story revolves mostly around two teenagers, Peter Houghton and Josie Cormier. Peter is a quiet and socially awkward boy who's been bullied basically his entire life. And Josie used to be one of Peter's childhood friends, but eventually becomes part of the popular crowd as they grow older. And that already tells you something. The book is very much about how friendships change, how people get pushed into different groups, and how school life can shape your identity in ways you don't even realize. The turning point of the novel is an incident that shocks the entire community, a tragedy at the local high school. I won't describe the event in detail because the book itself focuses less on what happened and more on everything surrounding it. The years of bullying that led up to it, the complicated emotional lives of the students, and how the town deals with loss and guilt and blame afterward. We follow police officers trying to understand what motivated everything, and parents trying to cope with the fact that they didn't see warning signs. Josie becomes one of the central characters as questions arise about how much she knew, where she was during the tragedy, and what role she might unknowingly have played in Peter's life beforehand. The novel slowly unpacks memories, friendships, misunderstandings, and choices that seemed small at the time, but in hindsight feel huge. Jodi Picoult doesn't simply point fingers or choose a villain. Instead, she explores how complicated people can be, how small actions affect someone long-term, and how sometimes entire communities shape situations without even realizing it. One of the biggest themes is bullying, and not just in a simplistic teasing way, but more like those little emotional cuts and humiliations that add up over years, changing how someone sees themselves. Some schools and libraries in the United States briefly removed it or restricted access, especially for younger readers, because the theme feels heavy and difficult to discuss. Persepolis. In the novel, Marjane Satrapi takes you into her life growing up in Iran during a time when everything around her was shifting. Politics, culture, everyday rules, and even the way children were allowed to think. The story starts in the late 1970s, when Marjane is a young girl living in Tehran. She's curious and outspoken, and ridiculously smart for her age. Her family is modern and educated, and openly talks about politics at home, which means she grows up hearing adult conversations about revolutions and rights. And because she's a kid, she takes all of this in with a mixture of excitement and confusion, which is exactly what makes this story powerful. The Iranian Revolution begins, and Marjane's everyday life suddenly looks different. Schools change, clothing rules change. She doesn't fully understand it yet, but she can feel that adults are suddenly more careful with their words, and that fear is now a quiet part of life. Satrapi tells big historical events through very ordinary moments, like telling about a family gathering, a simple walk home. And through those moments, you understand how political changes affect actual people. Soon, the Iran-Iraq War begins. Bombings, relatives going to the front, shortages at home, it all becomes part of her daily background. Yet her narration stays honest and grounded. The book was banned in many places because some readers were uncomfortable with how honestly it portrays war and fear, and the difficult realities families face during political upheaval. Some schools and regions hesitated to include it because it deals with heavy subjects like violence of war and cultural restrictions in a direct but thoughtful way. But the book doesn't promote harm. It doesn't glorify anything negative. It's a memoir meant to create understanding, and that's ultimately why it's so respected worldwide. It helps readers understand a part of the world through a child's eyes, without stereotypes and without simplification. Alright, so that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any book recommendations, drop it in the comments and make sure to check out my other videos.